Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The shelter's fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps as Dashiell Crane watched his entire world collapse. Across the crowded room, Marlowe Chen, the woman who'd brought him coffee every morning, who'd smiled at him like he mattered, stood wrapped in another man's arms. Not just any man. Torrance Whitmore. Dashiell's throat closed as he recognized his business rival, the predator who'd been trying to destroy Crane Industries for years. Torrance's hand slid possessively down Marlowe's back, and she didn't pull away. For 38 days, Dashiell had lived as a homeless man, sleeping on concrete, eating donated bread, searching for someone who could love him without knowing his billions. He'd found her, and she belonged to his enemy. Dashiell's hands trembled around the styrofoam cup, cheap coffee sloshing over his fingers. He'd grown his beard long, wore thrift store clothes that smelled like strangers, abandoned his penthouse to sleep in a shelter that reeked of disinfectant and broken dreams. All because he was tired of women who loved his wallet more than his soul. Marlowe had seemed different. She'd asked about his day like his answer mattered. She'd shared her sandwich when the shelter ran out of food. She'd touched his shoulder once, gently, when he'd pretended to cry about a fictional lost job. Now she laughed at something Torrance whispered, and that laugh, bright and genuine, cut deeper than any corporate betrayal ever had. You gonna drink that or just murder it? Jerome, the Vietnam vet who slept on the cot next to his, nudged Dashiell's shoulder. Jerome's eyes followed Dashiell's stare and hardened. That's Torrance Whitmore. Shut down the factory where my daughter worked. 300 people lost everything. Jerome spat the words like poison. And Marlowe? She's too good for that snake. Been volunteering here for 2 years, never asked for nothing. But watch her hands, they're shaking. She ain't comfortable. Dashiell looked closer. Jerome was right. Marlowe's smile was frozen, her body angled away from Torrance even as he pulled her tighter. Before Dashiell could process what he was seeing, Torrance grabbed Marlowe's wrist and yanked her toward the exit. She stumbled, her worn sneakers catching on the tile, and for just a second her mask slipped. Terror flashed across her face, raw and desperate. Her eyes swept the room, searching, pleading, until they locked onto Dashiell's. Her lips moved silently. Help me. Then Torrance shoved the door open, rain hammering the pavement outside, and dragged her into the storm. Every instinct in Dashiell's body screamed danger. This wasn't romance. This was control. This was a woman being hurt by a man who thought money made him untouchable. The styrofoam cup hit the floor, coffee spreading across concrete like spilled blood. Dashiell ran. Behind him, Jerome shouted something, but the words disappeared beneath the thunder of Dashiell's pulse. He burst through the shelter doors into freezing rain that soaked through his threadbare jacket in seconds. Torrance's black Mercedes idled at the curb, engine purring like a satisfied predator. Through the tinted windows, Dashiell saw Marlowe's silhouette, small and trapped. Torrance climbed into the driver's seat, and the car lurched forward. Dashiell sprinted after it, his boots slapping wet pavement, lungs burning, knowing he'd never catch them but unable to stop himself from trying. The Mercedes turned the corner and vanished, taillights bleeding red into the rain-soaked night. Dashiell stood alone in the downpour, homeless and helpless, watching the woman he'd fallen for disappear with a monster. His carefully constructed experiment, finding love without his billions, had led him here, powerless, gutted, realizing that sometimes money wasn't about greed. Sometimes it was about protection. Sometimes it was the weapon you needed to save someone who'd showed you kindness when you had nothing. Dashiell pulled his phone from the waterproof pocket inside his jacket, the one expensive thing he'd kept hidden. Tomorrow, he'd been planning to reveal the truth to Marlowe. Tonight, he was calling his head of security. The game had changed, and Torrance Whitmore had no idea who he'd just made his enemy. 6 weeks earlier, Dashiell Crane had stood in his Manhattan penthouse, 47 floors above a city that glittered like broken promises. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a man who had everything and felt like he had nothing. His phone buzzed, the 100th notification that day. Another gala invitation. Another woman who'd researched his net worth before agreeing to dinner. Another business deal wrapped in fake smiles. At 32 years old, he'd built a technology empire worth $4.3 billion. He'd been on magazine covers, spoken at conferences, closed deals that made headlines. But standing here, alone with his reflection and his expensive silence, he'd never felt more invisible. Not the kind of invisible poverty brought, the kind wealth created. "Your date's arrived, sir." Marco's voice crackled through the intercom. His assistant sounded professionally neutral, but Dashiell heard the judgment underneath. This was his fourth setup this month. Genevieve Rothschild waited in the living room. Yale graduate, corporate lawyer, daughter of old money. She'd mentioned his Forbes ranking 3 times during their phone call. She'd asked which of his properties he preferred for weekend getaways before asking his favorite color. When Dashiell walked into the living room, she was photographing his art collection on her phone. She didn't notice him for a full minute. He stood there, watching her document his wealth, and something inside him quietly broke. Dinner unfolded like a script he'd memorized through repetition. Genevieve laughed too hard at jokes that weren't funny. She touched his arm at calculated intervals. She steered every conversation toward business connections, society events, investment opportunities. When she excused herself to the restroom, Dashiell checked his phone and found a text from his mother. "Senator's daughter available next week." Perfect match. Perfect meant connected. Accomplished meant wealthy. No one ever asked if she was kind, if she'd love him when he was broken, if she'd stay if the money disappeared. His ex-fiancée Victoria had sold their engagement story to tabloids for $1 million. She'd never loved him, just his portfolio. That night, after Genevieve left with promises that felt like threats, Dashiell made a decision that would change everything. He'd read about a journalist who'd lived homeless to write about invisible poverty. What if he stripped away the suits, the penthouse, the power? What if he walked among people who had no idea who he was? Would anyone see him? Would anyone care? More importantly, could he find someone whose love wasn't conditional on his last name? The idea consumed him for 3 sleepless nights. It was dangerous, possibly stupid, definitely necessary, because Dashiell was drowning in gold, and he needed to know if anyone would save him if he had nothing. He spent a week planning, grew out his beard, stopped using his expensive hair products, bought clothes from Goodwill that smelled like other people's lives, a canvas jacket with permanent stains, jeans worn thin at the knees, boots that had walked miles before reaching his feet. He told his board he was taking a sabbatical for personal development and left Marco in charge with strict instructions. Don't contact him unless the company was literally burning. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning, Dashiell Crane walked out of his building without his wallet, his Rolex, or his identity. The doorman who'd greeted him every day for 5 years didn't recognize him. His driver passed him on the street without a second glance. For the first time in a decade, Dashiell smiled, a real, unguarded smile, because he'd finally become the kind of invisible he'd been searching for. Not the invisibility of being ignored despite your worth. The invisibility of having your worth completely unknown. He had 1 emergency credit card sewn into his jacket lining and a burner phone with Marco's number. Everything else, the penthouses, the cars, the carefully constructed life, stayed behind. That first night, sleeping on a cot in the Riverside Mission that smelled like bleach and defeat, Dashiell wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But then he remembered Genevieve photographing his art, his mother's texts about suitable matches, Victoria's betrayal, and he closed his eyes, embraced the scratchy donated blanket, and chose the unknown. 11 days into his new life, Dashiell met Marlowe Chen. She walked into the Riverside Mission carrying boxes of donated books, rain dripping from her secondhand jacket, her sneakers squelching against linoleum floors. Most volunteers swept through shelters like tourists in a zoo, eager to post about their charity on social media before running back to their comfortable lives. They wore designer athleisure, took selfies with hashtags about compassion, and avoided eye contact with the actual humans they were supposedly helping. Marlowe was different. She wore jeans with holes that weren't fashionable, just worn through from use. Her coat was 3 sizes too big, clearly someone else's cast-off. She didn't have her phone out. She simply showed up, helped, and listened. Dashiell watched from his corner cot as Marlowe spent 20 minutes helping old Jerome find a mystery novel, discussing plots like they were colleagues in a book club instead of a homeless veteran and a volunteer. When a teenager named Keisha asked about the donated laptops, Marlowe sat down and taught her how to write a resume, patient and thorough. She brought coffee from a corner cafe, not the watery shelter coffee, but decent brew she'd bought with money she clearly didn't have to spare. She remembered everyone's names, their stories, their small victories and ongoing struggles. And when she smiled, it reached her eyes, genuine warmth that made something crack open in Dashiell's chest. First time seeing her? Ruth, a grandmother who'd lost her apartment to an illegal rent increase, sat beside Dashiell. Marlowe comes twice a week, sometimes more. 3 months ago, my grandson got sick. Needed medicine the free clinic couldn't give us. Marlowe showed up the next day with everything. Didn't ask for thanks, didn't want recognition. Just said families take care of each other. Ruth's weathered face softened. That girl's got a heart bigger than this whole broken city. Works double shifts at some restaurant. Takes care of her younger sister. Still makes time for us. She's special. Dashiell's curiosity shifted into something more dangerous. Something that felt like hope. Over the next 3 weeks, Dashiell found himself timing his shelter visits to match Marlowe's schedule. She'd bring coffee in the mornings. 2 sugars for him after he'd mentioned it once in passing. She'd sit beside him during lunch, asking questions that never felt invasive. "What's your story?" she asked one rainy afternoon. Dashiell had prepared a cover story, but looking into her brown eyes, deep and genuinely interested, he told her pieces of truth. About feeling invisible. About searching for something real. About wondering if anyone would notice if he disappeared. "You're not invisible to me," Marlowe said quietly, and Dashiell believed her. For the first time in years, someone saw him as human, not as a bank account with a pulse. They talked about everything. Books and dreams and the city's unexpected beauty. She told him about her mother, who died of cancer when Marlowe was 16, leaving her to raise her younger sister Iris alone. She'd worked 3 jobs, put Iris through high school, sacrificed college to keep their family together. "Someone helped us when we had nothing," she explained. "I'm just passing it forward." She never asked what brought Dashiell to the streets, never pushed for details. She simply offered dignity, conversation, and kindness that expected nothing in return. And slowly, terrifyingly, Dashiell realized he was falling in love with a woman who thought he had absolutely nothing to offer. The guilt started small, a whisper when she shared her struggles, a sharp pain when she bought him coffee with money meant for her own bills. Every smile she gave him felt like a lie he was perpetuating. Every gentle touch was a betrayal of her trust. But every time he decided to tell her the truth, he remembered Victoria selling their engagement story. Genevieve photographing his assets. His mother's endless parade of suitable matches, who wanted his money, not his heart. So Dashiell stayed silent, trapped between the love growing in his chest and the deception rotting in his gut. He told himself he'd reveal everything soon. He just needed to be sure. Needed to know this was real. But deep down, he was terrified that honesty would destroy the only genuine connection he'd felt in years. For weeks into his homeless life, Dashiell's experiment began collapsing under its own weight. He developed real friendships at the shelter. Jerome taught him chess and told war stories that haunted Dashiell's dreams. Ruth shared her nursing knowledge when Dashiell caught a cold. Marcus, a 17-year-old trying to get his GED, asked for tutoring help with algebra. These people weren't research subjects anymore. They were his community. Their struggles kept him awake at night. Meanwhile, in his hidden life, Marco sent encrypted emails about Torrance Whitmore making aggressive moves to acquire Crane Industries subsidiaries. The company Dashiell built was under attack, and he was playing homeless, pretending poverty while his empire burned. The guilt intensified with every conversation with Marlowe. She'd shared her deepest wounds, her father abandoning them, the eviction notice that came 3 days after her mother's diagnosis, the shame of accepting charity. She trusted Dashiell with her truth because she believed he understood poverty from the inside. But he didn't. He owned properties he'd never visited, had millions in accounts he'd forgotten about. Every moment with her was built on deception, and the foundation was cracking. One evening, Marlowe invited him to the community center, where she taught free art classes to kids. The room exploded with color, murals covering concrete walls, children's laughter echoing off paint-splattered floors. A girl named Sasha grabbed Dashiell's hand to show him her butterfly painting. "Miss Marlowe says butterflies mean transformation," Sasha announced proudly. "Says we can all change into something beautiful, no matter where we start." Dashiell's throat tightened watching Marlowe crouch beside a frustrated boy, her patient encouragement transforming his tears into determination. This woman, who barely afforded rent, was giving these kids hope. She was pouring her limited resources into other people's futures. And what was Dashiell doing? Playing pretend, living a lie, using her genuine kindness as a test for his trust issues. The shame was suffocating. When Marlowe caught him staring, she smiled, that real, unguarded smile. And Dashiell wanted to confess everything right there. But cowardice kept his mouth shut. After class, Marlowe walked Dashiell to the bus stop, their shoulders brushing in the cooling evening air. "Can I tell you something weird?" she asked, staring at the graffiti-covered bench. "Sometimes I imagine what my life would be like if things had been different. If Mom hadn't gotten sick, if we'd had money for treatment, if I'd gone to college like I planned." Her voice cracked. "But then I think, maybe I wouldn't have learned to see people the way I do now. Maybe I wouldn't understand what truly matters." She looked at him, and Dashiell's heart hammered against his ribs. "You matter. I hope you know that. Your life has value, even when the world treats you like you're invisible." Dashiell wanted to kiss her, wanted to tell her everything, wanted to promise he'd fix every broken thing in her world. But the bus arrived, brakes squealing, and Marlowe squeezed his hand goodbye. Walking back to the shelter, Dashiell made a decision. 2 more weeks. He'd give himself 14 days to be absolutely certain about Marlowe's feelings, to ensure this was real and not proximity or pity. Then he'd reveal everything, his identity, his wealth, his reasons. He'd offer her the world, but more importantly, he'd offer honesty. He'd trust that the woman who saw him as human when she thought he had nothing would still see him when she learned he had everything. It was risky, potentially devastating, but Dashiell was exhausted from living behind masks. That night, lying on his shelter cot, Dashiell allowed himself to imagine their future. Telling Marlowe the truth over coffee. Watching her face cycle through shock, anger, maybe understanding. Explaining that he'd fallen in love with her kindness, her strength, her ability to see human dignity in a system designed to erase it. Offering to pay for Iris's college, to fund Marlowe's art programs, to build something real together. The fantasy was beautiful, but a small voice whispered warnings he tried to ignore. What if she felt betrayed? What if his deception destroyed her trust forever? What if the woman who valued honesty above all else couldn't forgive his elaborate lie? Dashiell pushed the doubts away and clung to hope. In 14 days, everything would change. He just prayed it would change for the better. The danger announced itself on a Wednesday. Dashiell was helping Marcus with algebra when Marlowe rushed into the shelter, her face drained of color, hands trembling as she set down her bag. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, didn't stop to chat. Instead, she headed straight for the kitchen and began organizing donations with mechanical precision, her movements jerky and wrong. Ruth noticed immediately, shooting Dashiell a worried glance. When Jerome tried joking about the terrible coffee, Marlowe flinched at the sound of his voice, then apologized profusely for overreacting. Something had happened. Something bad. And every protective instinct Dashiell had spent his life developing in boardrooms and hostile negotiations was now screaming danger. Dashiell waited until the dinner rush settled, then found Marlowe alone in the storage room, counting canned goods with tears streaking her makeup. "Hey," he said softly. She jumped like he'd fired a gun. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. Are you okay?" Stupid question. Clearly she wasn't, but Marlowe wiped her face and forced a smile that shattered Dashiell's heart. "I'm fine, just tired." Her hands shook as she wrote inventory numbers, and Dashiell noticed something he'd missed earlier. A bruise flowering purple along her wrist, the distinct shape of fingers gripped too tight. Ice flooded his veins. His voice came out deadly calm. "Marlowe, who did that to you?" She pulled her sleeve down fast, but the damage was visible. Not just the physical bruise, but the fear carved into her expression. "It's nothing. I'm clumsy, bumped into a door." The lie sat heavy between them, and Dashiell's fists clenched with fury, he forced himself to control. He'd spent years reading people, closing billion-dollar deals by understanding what wasn't being said. Marlowe was terrified. "If someone's hurting you," he said carefully, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage boiling in his chest, "you don't have to face them alone. We're your friends. Let us help." Marlowe's laugh was bitter, hollow, nothing like her usual warmth. "You can't help. Nobody can. He's too powerful, too connected. Just drop it, please." She left the shelter early, and Dashiell's mind was already working through scenarios. He needed information. Needed to know who had put fear in Marlowe's eyes. Dashiell followed her home, not close enough to be seen, but near enough to ensure her safety. She lived in a decrepit building in Alphabet City, third-floor walk-up with broken buzzers and gang tags spray-painted across the entrance. He waited across the street, watching her window light up, watching shadows move behind thin curtains. He was about to leave when a black Mercedes pulled up, sleek and expensive, completely out of place in this neighborhood. The driver's door opened, and Dashiell's blood turned to ice. Torrance Whitmore stepped out, adjusting his $1,000 suit, checking his Rolex like he owned time itself. Dashiell's business rival. The corporate shark who'd been trying to destroy Crane Industries for years. What the hell was Torrance doing here? Torrance entered Marlowe's building like he owned it, and 5 minutes later, raised voices echoed from her apartment. Torrance's booming authority cutting through the night, Marlowe's pleading response barely audible. Every instinct screamed at Dashiell to charge inside, to throw Torrance through a wall, to use every ounce of his hidden power to protect Marlowe. But barging in now would expose his deception, and potentially make things worse. So Dashiell stood frozen on the rain-slicked sidewalk, hatred burning through his chest, while the woman he loved remained trapped 3 floors above with a monster he knew all too well. Torrance Whitmore, ruthless, cruel, notorious for crushing competitors and buying whatever he wanted, including apparently people. When Torrance finally left an hour later, Dashiell memorized everything. His license plate, his satisfied smirk, the way he adjusted his cufflinks like he'd just closed a successful deal. Tomorrow, Dashiell would use his resources to investigate the connection between Marlowe and Torrance. Tonight, he kept watch until Marlowe's lights went dark, until he knew she was as safe as she could be in a situation that was clearly dangerous. Then he walked back to the shelter, pulled out his emergency phone, and texted Marco 6 words. "I need everything on Torrance Whitmore." The game had changed. This wasn't about finding love through a social experiment anymore. This was about protecting the woman who'd shown him kindness when she thought he had nothing. And Torrance had no idea he'd just made an enemy of the one person with the power to destroy him. By morning, Marco had sent Dashiell an encrypted file that made his stomach turn. Torrance Whitmore had a pattern. 3 former girlfriends with restraining orders, 2 who'd mysteriously dropped charges, 1 who'd fled the country entirely. He targeted vulnerable women, beautiful, kind, financially desperate, and used money as a cage. The file included photos from 6 months ago. Torrance at a charity gala with Marlowe on his arm, her smile tight and uncomfortable, her body angled away like prey trying to escape a predator's grip. The caption read, "Tech mogul with his latest companion, restaurant worker Marlowe Chen." Latest companion. Like she was an acquisition. A possession. Dashiell's hands shook as he read deeper, piecing together the nightmare. The connection was Iris, Marlowe's younger sister. She'd gotten into Columbia University last fall with what everyone thought was a full scholarship. Except it wasn't a scholarship. It was Torrance's money. He'd approached Marlowe when she was desperate. Her sister's tuition due, rent 3 months overdue, their world collapsing. He'd offered to help, made it sound like philanthropy. But nothing was free with men like Torrance. The strings he'd attached wrapped around Marlowe's throat and pulled tighter every day. According to Marco's sources, Torrance called her whenever he wanted, demanded her presence at events, controlled her schedule. And Marlowe couldn't say no because her sister's education, Iris's entire future, depended on his generosity. At the shelter that afternoon, Ruth cornered Dashiell in the hallway, her expression grave. "I know you care about Marlowe," she said quietly. "So you should know that man who comes around? Torrance. He's poison. Showed up 3 months back when Marlowe was drowning, offered to solve all her problems. Now he owns her. Calls her at midnight demanding she meet him. Shows up at her work, embarrasses her in front of customers. She can't escape because her sister's at Columbia on his dime." Ruth's voice dropped to a whisper. "Last week, I saw fingerprint bruises on her arms. Week before, she had a black eye she tried to hide with makeup. That girl's trapped, and she's too proud to ask for help." Dashiell felt rage he'd never experienced. Not in cutthroat business deals or hostile takeovers. This was personal. Visceral. The woman he loved was being hurt by a man who thought money made him untouchable. And she was suffering in silence because she was protecting her sister. The same selflessness that made Dashiell love her was the weapon Torrance used to control her. That evening, when Marlowe came to volunteer, Dashiell watched her more carefully. The way she checked her phone every few minutes with dread in her eyes. The way she flinched when someone entered loudly. The way she'd lost weight, her clothes hanging looser than before. She was being destroyed slowly, and everyone was too polite to say anything. During dinner service, Marlowe's phone buzzed. She read the message, and her face went white. Her hands started shaking so badly, she dropped a tray of sandwiches. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears flooding her eyes. I have to go. I have to go." She grabbed her coat and ran for the door, and Dashiell saw it clearly. A text from Torrance summoning her like she was property. Something inside Dashiell snapped. He was done watching. Done hiding. Done pretending he was helpless when he had the power to end this nightmare. He followed Marlowe outside into the freezing night, where she was trying to hail a cab with tears streaming down her face. "Marlowe, wait." Dashiell caught her arm gently. She turned, and the despair in her eyes nearly broke him. "You don't have to do this. Whatever hold he has on you, there are other options. Let me—" "You don't understand," she interrupted, voice cracking. "My sister. Her education. Her future. If I don't go when he calls, he'll destroy everything. He'll ruin Iris's life because I dared to disobey him." "I can't." A cab pulled up. Marlowe climbed in without finishing her sentence, and Dashiell stood on the sidewalk making a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he'd planned to tell Marlowe the truth about his identity. Tonight, he was done waiting. He pulled out his phone and called Marco. "Get the lawyers. I want Iris Chen's tuition paid in full, anonymously. And I want everything we have on Torrance Whitmore ready for war. It's time to end this." Dashiell spent that night in an all-night diner instead of the shelter, his emergency credit card paying for endless coffee while he strategized with Marco over encrypted messages. The plan was delicate. If Dashiell simply paid off Iris's tuition, Torrance would know someone was interfering and might retaliate against Marlowe. If he confronted Torrance directly as Dashiell Crane, Billionaire CEO, Marlowe would discover his deception in the worst possible way. He needed to free her from Torrance's control without revealing his identity, at least not yet. Marco suggested using a shell corporation to establish an emergency scholarship fund that would retroactively cover Iris's tuition, making Torrance's money unnecessary. It would take 72 hours to set up legally. 3 more days of Marlowe's suffering. Meanwhile, Dashiell had Marco dig deeper into Torrance's business practices. What they found was damning. Fraud, embezzlement, hostile takeovers built on intimidation and illegal tactics. Torrance had been playing dirty for years, but he'd hidden behind expensive lawyers and family connections. He thought he was untouchable. He'd never expected someone with Dashiell's resources to care about a restaurant worker from Alphabet City. That was Torrance's fatal mistake, underestimating the woman Dashiell loved and the lengths he'd go to protect her. By dawn, Dashiell had a 2-part plan. Liberate Marlowe financially, then destroy Torrance professionally. The second part would be deeply satisfying. At the shelter the next day, Marlowe didn't show up for her usual morning shift. Ruth checked her phone and frowned. She called in sick. First time in 2 years. The worry in Ruth's voice matched the dread pooling in Dashiell's stomach. He texted Marlowe from the burner phone she didn't know he had. "It's your friend from the shelter. Just checking if you're okay." No response. Hours passed. By evening, Dashiell was ready to break down her door when his phone finally buzzed. "Not okay, but I'll survive. I always do." The resignation in those words, the defeated acceptance that this was her life now, ignited something fierce in Dashiell's chest. No, she wouldn't just survive. She'd be free. He'd make sure of it. That night, Dashiell did something reckless. He went to Torrance's favorite restaurant, a pretentious steakhouse in Midtown where deals were made and power was displayed. Dashiell sat at the bar in his homeless disguise, nursing a water the bartender grudgingly provided, and watched Torrance hold court with business associates. Torrance was exactly as Dashiell remembered from their previous encounters, loud, arrogant, treating the waitstaff like servants. He bragged about his latest acquisition, a company he'd destroyed through hostile takeover, and laughed about the jobs lost. When someone asked about his personal life, Torrance smirked. "I'm training a new one. She's stubborn, but they all break eventually." The men around him laughed. Dashiell's hands clenched until his knuckles went white. The conversation continued, and Dashiell heard enough to make him physically ill. Torrance talked about Marlowe like she was an object, a project to be managed, a possession to be controlled. "The sister's the leverage," Torrance explained to his audience. "As long as Columbia tuition is due, the girl does whatever I want. It's beautiful, really. The cost of controlling her is less than I spend on my car payment." More laughter. More casual cruelty. Dashiell forced himself to stay seated, to stay invisible, to gather information instead of committing violence. But inside, he was screaming. This wasn't just about freeing Marlowe anymore. This was about making sure Torrance Whitmore never had the power to hurt anyone ever again. Dashiell left the restaurant with clarity crystallizing in his mind. Tomorrow, The scholarship fund would be established. In 3 days, Iris's tuition would be secured through legitimate channels that Torrance couldn't touch. Then Dashiell would tell Marlowe the truth about his identity. All of it. The deception, the reasons, the genuine love that had grown despite the lies. She might hate him, might never forgive the betrayal of his homeless disguise. But she'd be free from Torrance, and that mattered more than Dashiell's heart. After Marlowe knew everything, he'd unleash his legal team on Torrance. He'd expose the fraud, the manipulation, the pattern of abuse. He'd use every resource at his disposal to ensure Torrance faced consequences. Not as revenge, as justice. For Marlowe and every woman Torrance had hurt. On the 3rd day, everything exploded. Dashiell was at the shelter helping Jerome set up for lunch when Marlowe burst through the doors, her face bruised, her lip bleeding, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and defiance. Ruth gasped. Marcus jumped up, ready to fight whoever had done this. But Marlowe held up her hand, stopping everyone. "I told him no," she said, voice shaking but determined. "Torrance wanted me to quit my job, said I was embarrassing him by working at a restaurant. I told him no. So she touched her swollen lip gingerly. "It doesn't matter. I'm done. I'd rather lose everything than let him touch me again." Dashiell was moving before he could think, crossing the room in 3 strides, his careful disguise forgotten as fury took over. "Where is he?" The question came out deadly calm, and something in his voice made everyone go quiet. Marlowe looked at him, really looked, and seemed to see something she hadn't noticed before. "Who are you?" she whispered. Before Dashiell could answer, the shelter doors crashed open again. Torrance Whitmore stood in the entrance, his expensive suit completely out of place, his face twisted with rage. "There you are," he snarled at Marlowe. "You think you can just walk away? Your sister's tuition is due next week. Without me, she's done. You're done." "Actually," Dashiell stepped between them, his posture shifting from homeless wanderer to corporate predator in an instant. "Her sister's tuition has been handled. The Columbia Emergency Scholarship Fund, established 3 days ago, has awarded Iris Chen a full ride for all 4 years. Your leverage is gone, Torrance." Torrance's eyes narrowed, finally really seeing Dashiell. Recognition dawned slowly, then all at once. "Crane?" he breathed, disbelief and fury warring on his face. "Dashiell Crane? What the hell are you doing here dressed like?" He gestured at Dashiell's threadbare clothes. "Is this some kind of game to you?" Behind Dashiell, he heard Marlowe's sharp intake of breath. Heard her whisper his name like a question. Like a betrayal. "It started as something else," Dashiell admitted, not taking his eyes off Torrance. "But what happens next? That's not a game. That's a promise. You're done hurting her. You're done hurting anyone." Torrance laughed, a cruel, confident sound. "You think you can touch me? My family has connections you can't imagine. My lawyers are currently being served with subpoenas," Dashiell interrupted. "The SEC is investigating your company for fraud. The IRS is auditing your personal accounts. And 3 of your former girlfriends, the ones you thought you'd silenced, have agreed to testify about your pattern of abuse. I made some calls, pulled some strings. Turns out, when you're not terrifying vulnerable women, you're actually not that scary." Torrance's face went purple with rage. He lunged forward, fist raised, but Dashiell was ready. Years of boxing lessons kicked in. He sidestepped smoothly, caught Torrance's arm, and twisted him around into a restraining hold. "Don't," Dashiell said quietly. "You've already lost. Don't make it worse." Jerome was already on the phone with police. Ruth had her arm around Marlowe, who stood frozen, staring at Dashiell like she'd never seen him before. When the cops arrived minutes later, they found Torrance Whitmore, notorious for buying his way out of trouble, being held by a homeless man with the calm authority of someone used to controlling rooms. The officers recognized Dashiell immediately. One of them whistled low. "Mr. Crane, didn't expect to see you here." As police led Torrance away in handcuffs, charges pending, bail set impossibly high thanks to his flight risk status, Dashiell finally turned to face Marlowe. The shelter had gone completely silent. Everyone was staring. Marlowe's face cycled through emotions too fast to track: confusion, recognition, betrayal, anger, relief. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut deeper than any knife. "You lied to me. This whole time you lied." Dashiell opened his mouth to explain, to apologize, to somehow make her understand. But Marlowe turned and walked out of the shelter, leaving him standing there in his disguise, exposed and alone. He'd saved her from Torrance. But he'd lost her trust, and he had no idea if he'd ever get it back. Marlowe disappeared for 3 days. She didn't come to the shelter, didn't answer calls. Iris, when Dashiell's assistant finally tracked her down at Columbia, said her sister needed space to process everything. "She's not angry you helped," Iris explained carefully. "She's angry you pretended to be someone you weren't. She trusted you with her real self while you were wearing a mask. That's what hurts." Dashiell understood. He'd broken the foundation of what made Marlowe special, her ability to see people honestly. He'd asked for her genuine truth while offering only lies. The guilt was crushing, but he also knew giving her space meant leaving her vulnerable if Torrance's family or associates came after her for revenge. Dashiell compromised by hiring private security to watch Marlowe's building. Discreet enough she wouldn't notice, close enough to intervene if danger appeared. Meanwhile, the legal destruction of Torrance Whitmore accelerated beautifully. The SEC found evidence of fraud dating back 7 years. The IRS discovered offshore accounts and tax evasion schemes. 3 former girlfriends filed civil suits with mountains of documentation. Torrance's lawyers tried desperately to make deals, but Dashiell had ensured every door was closed, every escape route blocked. Within 72 hours, Torrance was facing criminal charges that would put him in prison for decades. His empire crumbled. His family connections couldn't save him. And Dashiell felt absolutely no mercy. On the 4th day, Marlowe finally called. "Meet me at the community center. The art room. 8 p.m. Her voice was emotionless, giving nothing away. Dashiell arrived early, his heart hammering. He'd showered, shaved, put on normal clothes, jeans and a simple shirt, nothing that screamed wealth. When Marlowe walked in, she looked exhausted but steady. She sat across from him at one of the paint-splattered tables and didn't speak for a long minute. Outside, rain hammered the windows. Finally, she said, "Tell me the truth. All of it. Why you did it, what you wanted, everything." So Dashiell did. He told her about the loneliness of wealth, the women who loved his bank account, the desperate need to know if anyone could see him as human. He told her about the social experiment that had become something real, about falling in love with her kindness, her strength, her ability to see dignity in people the world ignored. He explained why he'd stayed silent, even as guilt consumed him. The fear that revealing his wealth would destroy the genuine connection they'd built. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I should have told you sooner. Should have trusted you the way you trusted me. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for lying, for deceiving you, for using your kindness as a test for my trust issues." Tears blurred his vision. "But I need you to know, everything I felt was real. My feelings for you, my admiration, my love. That was never fake." Marlowe listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You know what the worst part is?" she finally said. "I understand why you did it. In your position, surrounded by people who want to use you, I might have done something similar. That's what makes me so angry. I can't even fully hate you for it, because part of me gets it." She laughed bitterly. "But understanding doesn't erase the betrayal. You watched me share my deepest pain while hiding your true self. You let me worry about buying you coffee while you have billions. You made me feel like we were equals when we're not, we never were." "You're right," Dashiell said. "We're not equals. You're better than me. Kinder. Braver. More genuinely good than anyone I've ever met. My money doesn't change that. It just proves my point. You have so little and give so much. I have everything and was still hollow inside until I met you." He leaned forward. "I can't undo the deception. Can't erase the lies. But I can promise you complete honesty from this moment forward. I can tell you that meeting you changed me fundamentally. I can offer you space, time, whatever you need. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like the chance to earn your trust again. Not as a billionaire trying to impress you. Just as a man who loves you and wants to spend his life proving he's worthy of your heart." 2 months later, Dashiell sat in the Riverside Mission teaching Marcus advanced algebra while Jerome set up chess pieces for their weekly tournament. He'd kept coming to the shelter even after the experiment ended, because these people had become his family in ways his blood relatives never had. Ruth was recovering from surgery, paid for by an anonymous donor, and was planning to move into new housing next month. Marcus had aced his GED and gotten into community college with a full scholarship. Jerome had reconnected with his daughter. The shelter had received a massive donation that ensured its survival for the next decade. And through it all, Dashiell had showed up, volunteered, and slowly rebuilt his understanding of what wealth was actually for. Marlowe had asked for space, and he'd given it. No contact except brief updates through Iris about how she was doing. She'd quit her restaurant job and started working at a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors. Torrance was in prison, his trial having been swift and brutal. His victims had found their voices, and justice, finally, had teeth. Marlowe had testified, her courage inspiring other women to come forward. Dashiell had watched from the gallery, proud and heartbroken, loving her from a distance while respecting the boundaries she'd set. He'd learned that loving someone sometimes meant letting them heal without you, even when every instinct screamed to fix everything immediately. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early spring, Marlowe walked into the shelter. Dashiell looked up from the chessboard, and his heart stopped. She looked different, stronger somehow, like she'd discovered muscles she didn't know she had. She walked straight to him, and everyone in the shelter went quiet, watching. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about honesty and trust and what it means to really see someone." She sat down across from him. "You were wrong to lie. I was right to be angry. But I also realize I fell in love with the real you. The parts that matter weren't the disguise. They were how you treated Jerome with respect, how you helped Marcus with homework, how you listened to Ruth's stories like they were important. Those parts were real," Dashiell confirmed quietly. "That's who I am when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain." Marlowe nodded. "I know. I've spent 2 months thinking about who you were at this shelter versus who you are in Forbes magazine. And you know what? They're the same person. You just dress differently." She smiled slightly. "So here's what I want. If we do this, if we try again, it has to be honest. Completely. No more masks for either of us. You don't pretend to be poor, and I don't pretend your wealth doesn't scare me. We figure out what it means to build something real when the power dynamic is so lopsided. We take it slow. We probably fight about money and fairness and what's charity versus what's love." "I can do that," Dashiell said, hope blooming in his chest for the first time in months. "Slow. Honest. Real. Whatever you need." Marlowe reached across the chessboard and took his hand. "I also want you to set up a foundation. Use your resources to help people like the ones in this shelter. Not as charity, as justice, as systemic change. Because you have the power to actually make things different. And I think that's why you were so miserable before. You were using your wealth to build more wealth instead of using it to build a better world." Dashiell's throat tightened. This woman, this incredible, fierce, visionary woman who'd taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. "Already done," he admitted. "The Marlowe Chen Foundation for Economic Justice. Funded with half my personal wealth. Focused on housing security, education access, and domestic violence prevention. Your sister Iris helped me design the mission statement. You're listed as the executive director, if you'll take the job. Full salary, complete control over operations, my money but your vision." Marlowe's eyes widened. "You named it after me? You're the one who taught me what wealth is actually for," Dashiell said simply. Seemed appropriate. Tears spilled down Marlowe's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You arrogant, manipulative, secretly kind-hearted billionaire." She leaned across the chessboard and kissed him, gentle and careful and full of possibility. Around them, the shelter erupted in cheers. Ruth was crying happy tears. Jerome was demanding Dashiell pay attention to the chess game. Marcus was already posting about it on social media. And Dashiell, for the first time since this whole experiment began, felt completely, genuinely seen. Not as a billionaire. Not as a homeless disguise. Just as himself. Flawed and trying and in love with a woman who'd taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the people who stayed when you had nothing, who challenged you to be better, who transformed your resources into hope for others. He'd started this journey searching for someone who could love him without knowing his money. He'd found someone who loved him despite it. And that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below telling me which moment hit you hardest. Was it when Marlowe discovered the truth? When Dashiell confronted Torrance? When they found their way back to each other? Your thoughts matter. Share them below.